Good morning. Is anybody there?
Hi, how are you?
Oh, I'm well. Melissa?
Yes, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
So I'm really thrilled to be speaking with you today. I got to say, I was checking out the work that we will be talking about today, and I was just blown away. I got to be honest with you. This is such an amazing work that you did. And I think, I just got to be honest before we kind of get started here. The work is so interesting. So
Oh, wow.
amazing. Yeah, I just want to thank you for this amazing collection. I mean, it's something really special. So yeah,
Oh,
congratulations on it too.
that means so much to me. And now I'm going to sound totally insincere when I say that I've been inhaling so many of the episodes of Calling, but I really was going to say that because it's very much true.
Oh goodness. Well, I do appreciate it, but let's get started, shall we? Let's
Sure.
let's see. I want to start at the beginning as much as I want to talk about the poetry collection right here, right now. I want to get a sense of where you come from, and if it's okay for me to ask, where does your story begin? Where are you from? What inspired your creative journey to get started?
Oh, sure. Well, I was raised in Connecticut, more or less since the age of 4. After my parents divorced, we came back to where my mother was from. And I've just kind of bopped around different places in Connecticut for most of that time, although my father had moved to South Carolina, so I spent a significant amount of time in the summers there. And so that's the geography of it. And I really, in terms of poetry, I really didn't even think about it or pursue it until about 10 years ago.
Hmm.
And I had, I think I'd primarily thought of myself as a fiction writer, but
Uh-huh.
I could never really get any of my ideas off the ground when I would try to work on a short story or novella. And
Hmm.
somehow, when I just, whatever, just gave into the idea of poetry, then a lot of dots were connected, and somehow I was able to tell stories and my
Hmm.
own experiences so much better through poetry.
Interesting. And so you came to that a little bit later. You were set on doing fiction then, or that was an aim that you had since you were younger, or did you come to writing in general later in life?
Well, I always thought of myself, as a writer, and I was like a million people. I was, you
Hmm.
know, usually writing novels in notebooks, in math
Yeah.
class and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
and I, won a couple contests in college, but I think in a way I was, time slips by and I
Hmm.
was I was able to find work in writing and communications, but
Hmm.
I think I was still telling myself that in terms of the creative side, that I was, like a short story writer. But as I said, I was totally delusional because I wasn't really finishing any of these fantastic ideas I was coming up with.
That sounds like me in fiction, I have to be honest.
Oh, really?
It is my Mount Rushmore, or what do you call it? Like my Mount Everest of things to do is
Right.
finish one of the many novels that I have stowed away. But it's elusive, right? And as you said,
Mhm.
time is the biggest danger of all. Like feeling like you have the time to pursue this when in fact years or maybe decades could go by without something concrete actually coming together. And I feel like that's happened for me. I don't know about you, like if you felt like you were running out of time to do certain things.
I think so. And I think without admitting it to myself, I kind of just put it aside. And it's a definite craft, fiction writing.
Uh-huh.
And I think you never say never, of course, but
Yeah.
I think I'm now realizing that it's not really in the skill set that I, at least up till
Mhm.
now.
Yeah, yeah. But you can sort of get a sense of that interest in the work that I was reading. And I think maybe that's why I appreciated it so much, because as I'm looking at it, the moment it begins with a cast of characters, I am in. I am completely sold. And so, just to maybe paint a picture here, Red Low Fog, correct?
Right, right,
This is such a an interesting, peculiar uh, creation, I have to say. And as a playwright, I think maybe that's what lured me in. I felt like you have a cast of characters. I am in. I'm sold. And then you start taking different turns. I'll go back to your your creative origins, but I think I'm just too excited to to learn more about how you how you brought this collection into the world. This because it's not really a collection; it's a narrative.
right.
And I'm really interested in how this came to be. If you could give us a bit of its origin for the listener.
Yeah, as I was saying, it's funny because the idea for it predates actually my interest in or attempt at poetry because I was just a couple months ago, I found a printed out email that I'd written to an old friend who's a professor of children's literature.
Mm,
And I was asking him a little bit about what his sense was about how, were there superstar children's book authors in the 70s to his knowledge. But the
mm,
interesting thing about it was that I realized that the date stamp on the email was something like 2006.
mm,
So I really had this thought, and I think I knew that I wanted it to read like a transcript, that it was going to be a documentary. But I was going to, it was going to be sort of a kind of a hybrid fictional piece. And that's a great example of me kind of not knowing how to do it.
mm,
And then somehow, after I'd been writing poetry for a few years, the idea came back to me, and suddenly I was thinking, well, just what if each of the characters or each of the entities had a specific poetic form that they spoke in,
mm.
and somehow it just kind of all came together from there.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating because it does feel like a kaleidoscope of perspective. The whole time you're reading it, every character is defined, and I think it is because so much consideration must have gone into what kind of form they would be speaking in. And I don't want to give anything away, and it feels like the more I talk about it, I wouldn't want to spoil anything for the potential prospective reader. But I love that at the end of the book, you actually put in a bit of an afterword on what the reasoning was behind some of the forms that you chose. Would you mind sharing a little bit on that, on how you made those choices? And I know it might be hard without giving something away, but
Oh, well, sure. And that's okay if we spoil something there. But I think maybe because the main character, Delphine, is the closest to my heart. Um, and maybe because I've always been so fascinated with the villanelle, probably thanks to Elizabeth Bishop.
mm,
Somehow that was definitely um, that just sort of came to me without really pursuing what it should be. And I knew that I wanted to have a couple of book reviews in there that were kind of, I was imagining, what if Molly Bloom wrote a Kirkus review, of a children's books, kind of really heightened and rambling. So I knew I wanted to do something like that and kind of make it because they're picture books, kind of make that an ekphrasis.
mhm,
And and then I got interested in Japanese poetry forms, particularly when I found out that there was one um, really ancient called the Sudoku that was traditionally, it was three lines and then a lover would answer in the next three lines.
mm,
Like the later haikus, it had a specific, syllable structure and so forth. But
yeah,
that really fascinated me because my sense of Delphine and the man she falls in love with, Thomas,
mhm,
was that they have this connection. Even when things go wrong, they have this connection. So it just, again, it's hard to even remember. I'm sure that I, at some point, was looking up, what are different
Right.
poetry that feel right for these certain things. And then when I really felt like it was coming together as a cohesive work was when I uh, started thinking about these witnesses. There are 12 witnesses. You
Mm.
only hear from each one once, and not like on consecutive pages, but they form a chain throughout the book. And um, there's a form that I found called the Katina Rondeau, it's sort of like, if I can even remember, it's like it's the second line and the next one is the first and the fourth line and so forth, and it makes a chain. And you know I wanted to write it that if the reader didn't even happen to notice that those lines were repeating from the previous witness, that would be okay, but that it does, at least subliminally, I hope,
And I think
kind
that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, that's okay, I was wrapping up.
I do think that was super effective because, especially when you spoke of it in terms of the witnesses being more like a Greek chorus, then you start speaking my language and I immediately was in. But even before I got to that description, at the end, it felt like these folks all have their personality as much as they have their role in the narrative. And I think for me, that's why I love this so much, because it was so effective, and it felt very tragic as well as emotional. Especially when you use those forms, like you said, with the couple, it felt like romance was happening, like togetherness, a connection. And there was a line, and I'm sure I'm gonna get it wrong. It was like, um, being halves that were incomplete. And I just love that so much, because I think as much as the right choice of words made it effective, I think the form was doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And that's why I was so taken by the choices. I gotta commend you on that, because it was so much fun to feel like you were getting taken by the form, but you didn't even know it, because I'm fairly form illiterate, I'm still learning a lot of this stuff, but it was so well crafted. Um,
Oh, thank you so much.
so to go back to some of your inspirations and the things that you sort of enjoyed, you mentioned Elizabeth Bishop. Were there other poets or creatives, artists that you were consuming at the time that you put this together, or maybe ones that resonated with you growing up?
Yeah, I think that I kept there were things that were coming back to me, people that were really important to me as I was writing this. And even if I couldn't think of the obvious ways that they were, Richard Brodigan is a huge influence. I don't know, maybe just because he's wonderful. But he's also kind of zigzagging between poetry and kind of a quasi novels,
Mm.
and also just the music of the 70s. That was such a great era for story
Oh
songs and the
yeah, yeah.
singer-songwriter, like troubadour era.
I love that. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Were there some standouts? I got to ask for my music collection so I can get some some of your recommendations.
Oh no, my mind will totally go blank. But like Bobby Gentry was a great
Okay.
singer-songwriter, and she wrote Ode to Billy Joe, and
Hmm.
um, she wrote the song Fancy, which Reba McEntire later made a big
Okay.
hit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so she was a big one, but Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and even kind of novelty songs like The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia.
Hmm.
I was kind of a little kid during that era, but they really captured my imagination. And I had so many siblings and siblings who were,
Hmm.
you know, teens and 20s when I was a kid. And so, how you idolize your older siblings. So I
Uh-huh.
was really paying attention to, you know, my stepsister who loved Jackson Brown, things like
Oh,
that.
goodness.
So,
Yeah, I just started listening to more of the deep cuts of Jackson Brown. I had only known him fairly superficially, and then I went back and I realized everything that I had been missing out on because lyrically, even at such an early age, he was just a phenomenon in the way
yeah.
that he could, yeah, be emotional with such clarity. What was that song that he came up with? The one for Nico, and I saw that on YouTube somewhere, and maybe it was a cover, but it was clear enough that I could hear the lyrics. And they said that he
Hmm.
wrote that at like 17, and I'm like, what 17-year-old or 16-year-old can write like that? you know? Um,
No, that's almost irritating. Kate Bush,
yeah,
I
yeah.
recently found out that Kate Bush wrote one of my favorites, which is The Man with the Child in His Eyes, when
Mm.
she was like 14.
Oh,
Um, and a lot of her important work is like pre-20, but
wow.
yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. But you felt like you connected with those things and they're still a part of the way that you see the world, right? In some way.
Yeah, I would say so.
Mm. So, how long did the collection take to come together? Would you say?
I think in terms of real writing, like I said, I had this idea like 15 years ago or more, but I was writing other poems, and um in fact, I was just recently looking through my chapbook and I realized that like 90% of that one was stories as well.
Mm.
Um, but that's a little bit of a tangent, but I also realized that for better or for worse, after the 2016 election,
Uh-huh.
my creativity went right down the drain. And I remember I did come up with some villanelles during that point, and I must have been
Mm.
thinking about it more than I realized. But it is amazing after the inauguration in
Uh-huh.
2020. It's not like I said, okay, there's a new president. Now that
Let's go
is
back to
there. But somehow the majority of it was done in January and February of that year.
Oh, that's
So,
fascinating. Yeah, because you know that there's some folks who get mobilized in a kind of activism sort of way where they take their craft and then when things get tough, like 2016, everyone's writing poems about the sort of like the counter to what's going on in
right.
the political mainstream. And I find that I'm kind of like you in a sense in that I just kind of shut down a little bit. Like I would try to create something, to make something, and it didn't feel right. I felt like burned out before I even began. Do you feel like that was kind of the case with you?
I think so. I mean, I'm not, I certainly have no, um, I'm interested in political poetry to a
Mm,
certain extent, but I guess it's not the first thing that I would read necessarily, and it's certainly
sure.
not something that I was maybe I should have been, maybe even if the product was horrible, it would have been, better
Yeah.
than ranting on Twitter for 4 or 5
Yeah.
years. But for better or worse, that's kind of what happened. But it must have been sort of churning in there somewhere because it really came out very, very quickly
Mm. I think it was
once I,
just, yeah, the right time possibly for you. Like it had
yeah.
been sitting enough. In previous projects, do you feel like you have to let them sit after a while, not looking at something that you've already drafted or worked on?
I think that I now know that that's what I should do, but I would just kind of write things and send them out, and and some of them would be accepted by uh, publication, and that would be really exciting. But sometimes things would come back with really helpful suggestions,
Mm,
and I took those to heart. So, but I think now I'm more of a simmerer than I used to be.
mm. And just to just clarify a bit, this is your second poetry book that you've put together. Is that correct? Or have you worked on several before?
No, I had a previous chapbook that came out in
Oh, okay.
2015. And then we had the great um, Black Dark Ages, and then this Red Low Fog transcript is the next one. So just two in total.
Oh, wonderful. So, from the first collection to the second, what did you feel were some things that you're taking from the first one onto the second one? If there's any kind of learning experiences or things that you really felt like, I'm not going to do this again, or I feel like I'm better in this particular area.
Well, one thing is it's maybe not so much an artistic journey, but a lot of the things in the first chapbook. Well, the poems in the chapbook were really inspired by a lot of research I was doing about global traditions, holiday traditions,
Mm,
and uh, harvest moments, harvest celebrations, and things like that. But they really, in the interim between my writing those poems and then starting to work on this collection, what happened is my two children started college and really
mm,
started kind of teaching us so much. And
mm,
really, we spent a lot of time talking about cultural appropriation. And I do have to say, looking at my collection, my chapbook,
mm,
that even though I'm always kind of visiting these things as a tourist, or a friend of
mm,
somebody who celebrated these things.
sure.
I don't know that I would make these same choices now. But and in fact, the looking at it, I think the couple of poems that I wrote that were just like my experiences, I think are a little bit stronger. So
Mm,
that is something that I've spent more time thinking about.
yeah. And that's such an important conversation to have with oneself and with the community as a whole, the creative community, because I personally feel like there's got to be a way for a creative who is not of a certain culture to be able to show or share a perspective on something that is not something that's native to them. If that makes sense. It's such a difficult thing because I think that now, you know, people of color and people of other cultures, do have a right to sort of take center stage on what their own culture is and presenting it in
Yes.
the way that they see fit. I totally agree. As a Mexican, who's aimless in the land of Wyoming, I totally get it. It's important for us to reclaim our culture, but I also feel like you shouldn't have to censor an observation, because you're outside of a certain group, especially if it comes from a place of good, right? Which I know that you strike me as an ally or somebody who, who would have the sensitivity to to speak about these things. But
It's
um,
definitely a goal. Thank you. But
yeah,
yeah, it's a goal, but it's hard to know. I
yeah,
in the
yeah,
in this transcript, I was noticing that as I was going to kind of name people and come up with backstories, even if they were just not just for my own sake,
mm,
I realized that I was going to my comfort zone of like these sturdy New England Yankee names. When I tried to write a novel in college, I remember that I turned to these everybody had like
mm.
Apple names, and stuff like that, and Honeycrisp. But sort of, there are a lot of old ancient apple varieties, and I was
Uh-huh,
kind of using that as an inspiration. But those were like those granite faced Yankee types,
uh-huh,
and as I started doing this, I realized that I just don't want to do that anymore. Like you
mm,
said, there's got to be a middle ground. And so I kind of it was important to me to not just have a completely whitewashed
sure,
set of characters,
sure.
what possible.
Yeah, and I think you did a great job at that because it never like my difficulty with some works is that they become an edict uh, of a certain kind as to how you need to incorporate anyone and everyone, and then at that point it just feels manufactured. Whereas I'm more of a fan of the Apple theory that you've put forth, right? There's another way to create inclusiveness with magic, with metaphor, with a little bit of an observation that shows us that there is variety, there is a whole bunch of perspectives. And I think, we just get caught up in certain edicts that may not fit what we want to do. But as long as it comes from a place of good, and I could tell the moment I started reading your work that I'm like, okay, this is a person who has no hatred in their heart. There's empathy there, for people. So you definitely don't have anything to worry about. Um, but sorry, we kind of got off on a tangent there.
Oh, no, but I'm glad we did I mean, I am personally glad that we did because it is, I'm definitely interested in your perspective. I mean, the narrator is Mexican
Hmm.
from Texas.
Yeah,
And I felt for some reason that's just how you start picturing people, and that's just how
yeah,
he came to me. But at the same time, I sort of thought, well, he's the narrator, and we know bits about him and glimpses of his marriage, but it's not,
hmm.
again, I I thought that that might be okay. So I'm kind
Oh,
of relieved.
absolutely. Absolutely. Because you need to have a person who is not from the community in the way that you set up the story to give that sort of outsider perspective in a way to what was happening, and to make the documentarian couple just sort of that background. I thought was super interesting. And I thought it really created a contrast, especially because they were a couple as well. And so you could kind of look, at the differences between how they worked as a couple versus our protagonist couple. So that was, I thought, a really successful part of it. But now a part of this collection, and one of the things that I really enjoyed about it too, was that it's it's a conversation about art and collaboration in a way. Can
Mhm.
you speak to how that came into the mix, or how you started to find that theme in what you were writing?
Well, I I can remember probably at a formative period of my time, and my husband's a writer, and
Mm,
when we were first together, it was like, how do you present I it just
yeah,
I was
yeah.
thinking more of you can't help thinking of yourself as a brand in a way.
Uh-huh.
I didn't realize that at the time, but it's kind of a really pernicious way to think, to kind of, start a life together um, if you're not just really, if you're constantly thinking about, oh, we're a creative couple in the world and we're
Yeah.
really interesting. And of course, he was no help because we'd go to, the rare cocktail party and someone would say, so where do you come up with your ideas? And he would just be, he just hated that kind of talk. And
Mm.
so I won't say he like flipped a table, but he just wasn't really interested in he's a very nice person. So I
Yeah.
don't, but he just wasn't, he definitely was not interested in what I now think of as the branding of a couple. But at the
Mm,
time, I was really fascinated by, Bill Moyers had a series in which he would go
mm,
to, this was definitely an influence. He would go to um, the homes of couples who were like married poets, like Donald Hall
mm.
and Jane Kenyon were one. And then there's another couple, which I would rather not name because they didn't end well.
Oh.
But at the time, I remember just being so struck when I watched it and they were still, intact and everything was fine. The way that they talked, it was really, we breathed together. Even when we have our individual uh, projects, we're kind of collaborating in each
Mhm.
other's works. It sounded so magical to me.
Right. A
And
little,
then
yeah. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
oh, no, I was just gonna say, and then, I mean, then just as you get older and older, you sort of are reading more biographies and you're realizing that it can be magical, but there is a danger in presenting yourself or just like letting yourself think of your partnership in that way, whether it's artistic or just marital. It just becomes
Yeah,
like Instagram wasn't around at the time, but kind of like this Instagrammable life rather
right.
than just living your actual life.
And I felt like you did that really well with Thomas. And correct me if I'm wrong on this. It's just kind of the initial perception that I got from him is that he seemed to be the more idealist one. And such grand idealism kind of turned into something else. Would you say that's kind of how you saw that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, Delphine is a couple years younger. They're both very young in this, but they're like the wonder kids of the, young
Hmm.
adult or the picture book world rather. But she's had she's been knocked around a little bit in life by the time she meets him.
Hmm.
Whereas he's been a bit more sheltered and living in this great camp in the Adirondacks and also he just I think by nature is has a marketing spirit.
Hmm.
And so um when Alex and Birgit, the documentarians, arrive, it's Thomas who's really kind of running around and
Hmm.
showing them things and like sort of telling them how, you know,
Yeah.
almost like being a background director in a way.
Hmm. Yeah, I just thought that was so clever. And I wonder if that was something that you mentioned you worked in communications at some point in time. Is that something that came from the type of work that you did in your day job, or was that something that just felt right for the character, or something that you could kind of use from your work experience?
It probably is something that did trickle down because I've been on both sides of the kind of marketing thing out
Mm,
of for about 5 years. I worked for a nonprofit anti-hunger agency
mm,
and I was the communications person and obviously all for a very important cause, but you are like picking out, you're going to soup kitchens and saying, "Hey, where's a good success story that's
right,
like,
right.
light and bright and everything."
Uh-huh.
And then after after I left that and I was freelancing for a while, then my next kind of proper job was as a newspaper reporter for, a small weekly paper,
Mm,
but you're still getting a lot of press releases and you're still being sent out to interview people who have um, an exhibit or their own book that they've written and just in reading the press releases or looking at how they're presenting themselves, um it just is something that makes you aware of that tension between, it is important when you can. It is important to try to talk about your work, but at the same time you do find yourself slip it's too easy to slip into a role, an archetype, I guess.
uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, I think that it worked really well. And if there was anything to draw from your personal backstory, I think it wasn't something that was front and center or anything. I just thought that maybe it could be a little bit of an inkling, right? Of like, oh, I get to use this kind of subset of skills, kind of put them in, in this character, but it felt very organic. It definitely wasn't anything like, oh, she's using her marketing skills or whatever. But
Right.
I'm curious of your background when you did a lot of this newspaper work or communications work. Is it really true that writing for your day job just completely burns you out and prevents you from doing creative work? Is that was that your experience?
It was my definitely my experience. There are people who manage that, but for me, Um, it it was it yeah, it just did take up all my creative energy.
Mm.
Uh, even even if I did try to find creative things to write about at the newspaper, but of course you're also still writing about the water treatment plant or the great budget debate of, '03 and
Yeah.
stuff like that. So it just the trying to translate something that's abstract, and translate it and make it reader friendly is um, it's creative. It takes a lot of energy.
Right. Right. So now that you have consistently put out some work and you have this book coming, what have you learned in terms of your practices, like creative practices, writing practices? Could you share a little bit about how you work or how you get stuff done when it comes to your writing output?
Well, I definitely over-research things as a way to procrastinate. I don't think I'm alone in that, but it's definitely my particular bugaboo. I'm working on a project right now which does require research, but a couple people have said to me, "Yeah, I know you want to know, uh, you know, such and such, but you could start making your way into this." And I think that's true. Thank you for the gentle hints, friends. But yeah, I feel like I'm undisciplined as a person just in general, and
Mm,
I have depression and anxiety and so forth. So it's definitely feast or famine with me.
mm, yeah. Do you feel that now that the collection is out, there is a bit of relief in your creative life for the time being?
Yeah, I think so because I don't, I'm at the beginning of this and I'm even sort of thinking of splintering off and writing some, because this what I'm writing now would be almost another story type of thing, and I also want to just be making some poems from my actual life. So all that stuff, but it is the fun stuff where I'm doing a lot of figuring out of what to focus on and what would be the form and what would be the
Mm.
voice. And it's definitely so I'm not having to present it to anybody. Sending things out is horrible. Uh,
I
I'm
agree.
definitely better at it than when I first started 10 or 12 years ago,
Mhm.
and would live or die by every single response, every
Sure.
email that came in. But but sending out, you know, Red Low Fog to contests was it was you could feel kind of defeated. In fact, I was mentioning that I kind of completed it in 2020,
Mhm.
and I thought I had anyway, and I sent it out to 10 or 12 contests, and what won none of them.
Mhm.
But in that time, then I took another 6 months or so, and then really I realized where the weaknesses were. So I think I had sent it out too fast. But anyway,
Mhm.
then I sent it out to another 10 or so. And, fortunately, and I was really lucky that Animal Heart Press didn't just accept it, but was just so enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, yeah. There's a right kind of excitement going on over at Animal Heart. I was curious of the next project that you have coming up. If you could elaborate, unless it's top secret, I totally get it.
It's definitely not top secret, although it might make you laugh given what happens to Thomas and Delphine in Red Low Fog, but I'm sort of right now I'm picturing it as a graphic novel
Mm.
that will probably contain verse. And
Oh, cool.
the kind of funny or ironic part is that my husband will probably be he's interested, he's accepted the job of being the illustrator. So, it's like, what am I doing? I think it's, we've been together long enough that I don't think we have the same kind of dangers that Thomas and Delphine did.
Sure, yeah. I,
It definitely doesn't have Thomas's challenges, but yeah, so it is actually going to be an alternative history.
mm,
Um, and the premise is what what would have happened in the earliest days of European settlement in the 1600s
mm,
if the Marymount colony had succeeded and the Plymouth colony had failed, or at
mm,
least not been our big, point of
mm,
reference. In other words, what if the Puritans had not been our, the
mm,
stone?
yeah.
So I didn't know much about the Marymount colony and Thomas Morton, the leader, until a couple of years ago. And I can't even remember what the rabbit hole was. I know Hawthorne wrote a story called The Maypole of Marymount, and he kind of posits about that it was at that moment, which was a real moment, it was either hanging in the balance of whether I think he put it as like sunshine would prevail because Marymount was like Woodstock. It was just a swing, or would the like shadow of Puritanism fall,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
of course, that did unfortunately in some ways the shadows prevailed. So
Mm,
alternative histories are really interesting because so often the premise is what if the worst possible thing had happened?
uh-huh.
What if the Nazis won, or what if,
Sure.
the slavers, what if the Civil War went the wrong way?
Mm-hmm.
And, and I'm sure around the world they have their own versions of events that were really important to that
Mm-hmm.
region. Um, but we seem to be fixated on Nazis and plantations. But anyway, I just was it just struck me when I learned about Marymount and that
Mm.
that the the Plymouth colonists destroyed it,
Wow.
um, exiled Thomas Morton, and so it seemed 400 years after the fact, it just seemed really poignant to me. And I started thinking, what if
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Morton's vision, which was very much about um, uh, working with the local Native Americans and building community with them.
Right.
Um, that had happened. He also was very he rescued all these indentured servants, and he was very much against any kind of slavery. So what if they had taken on slavery and or chattel slavery from Africa and
Mm-hmm.
just that kind of thing. So mine will probably end up being quite utopian, um, but you can do what you want when it's an alt history.
Absolutely. And I have to say, that is incredibly fascinating because you touch on a good point. We, in the alternative history kind of fandom, or whatever you want to call it, in that realm, we do obsess over the dark timeline, right? The thing that is going to bring cataclysm, and we got to be grateful for what we have. That sort of mentality, because it could have been a lot
Right.
worse. But I think it's so useful to come up with another way to use that sort of what if, because when you do it that way, the way that you propose, you're creating models for good, right? For opportunities to see what we have and how we can make it better, how it could have been better, whereas just staying stagnant, and not thinking of how to improve. Because I think that's the benefit that that kind of work provides, right? Is being able to say, look, we're not done yet. I mean, we could make this a lot better. And I think that a lot of us kind of get stuck in this feeling of like, well, maybe this is as good as it's going to get. and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just with, you know, what happened with subjugating different, different, well, of course, destroying the Native American culture
Hmm.
and all the millions of lives lost, but also just in terms of the things that we seem to prize in this country,
Hmm.
in terms of work, it should feel like work. It should, there shouldn't be, there's no having a sense of meditation or play that's not really valuable.
Hmm.
And um, Thomas Morton was, he wrote a manifesto when he got exiled back to England. He wrote this whole manifesto called the New English Canaan, and a lot of it had to do with that mentality of having a more playful mentality, as well as respecting their Native American neighbors that they were trading with all up and down the coast.
Hmm.
And I don't really want to make him the savior of this
Sure.
thing, but at the same time, if he could have been the leader of the European settlers and had been the one who, helped create a culture rather than, Governor Bradford from the Plymouth colony
Sure.
and the other Puritans that came just after that, it would have been, you know, that's just kind of what I'm playing with
Mm.
right now.
Well, that is really exciting. I think that's going to be a wonderful project that you folks are going to be putting together. And so please, please, I beg you, when you finish it or when you get it out into the world, come and talk to me about it because I want to continue that conversation. I think it's going to be really beneficial and really awesome.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
I have like just one or two more questions to be mindful of your time. This has been amazing. And I got to say, it's been a lot of fun talking to you. But
For me too.
so let me ask you this. What are some things that you have learned during your time as a writer that you'd be interested in sharing with those who are just starting out in their creative journey? Things that you know to be true about your craft as you see it now.
Well, one thing that surprised me for this collection, the Red Low Fog transcript, is that I can vividly remember thinking when it started to come together, for example, that I wanted to incorporate formal uh, poetry forms and just all this stuff that I barely was had any experience as a poet, let alone
Mm,
tackling formal forms. And I just thought, well, this I'm going to have to be kind of, again, I love to procrastinate by researching things, but I really did believe that I was going to have to undertake so many years of formal study in order to even like live up to my own concept. And I think so that is but then I for whatever reason I just said I just feel like doing this and just kind of staggered and stumbled my way through it. And I'm glad that for once I didn't let those second guesses prevail. So
mm,
for me, I mean, it does feel ridiculous to think of myself giving anyone advice, but if this is meaningful to anybody, if you have a concept that seems really ambitious, um, it's for me, it was surprising how my confidence grew as I was tackling each different form, and
mm.
with each time that I felt like I'd gotten it, it just informed the next thing and the next thing. So that would be a piece of advice. Just don't let your own ideas intimidate you.
Wonderful, wonderful. And lastly, what is your hope for the future?
I hope that you know, just as because I had friends when I was younger who were poets and therefore I wasn't, and that kind of thing. I would hope that that I don't limit myself to thinking of myself as one kind of writer, that if something is calling to me, that I will, feel comfortable pursuing it because um, if it doesn't work out, I'll probably end up cannibalizing it in 10 years for something else, you know?
Well, that's a wonderful, wonderful note to end on. I want to thank you so much, Melissa, for this incredible work that you've put out into the world, for sharing a little bit of your perspective, and for being so generous with your time. I feel like time just went past and went right by us, but it's been a real pleasure. And again, thank you so much for this amazing work, and congratulations, because this is an award-winning book.
Thank you so much. And I mean, again, I don't want to sound sickly sweet, but if somebody just happened to stumble on this podcast through this episode, just what do you have, like 60 or 65 by now? Just keep going. It's just so fascinating. Look at all, or listen to all the other episodes.
Oh, I really appreciate it. We're just chipping away one episode at a time, trying to get the word out. And I'm really glad that I got to talk to you, because this was definitely a highlight. And I'm going to be checking out this book when it comes out. Go pre-order it, folks. This is over at what's the website that it's at, Melissa?
Well, it's Animal Heart Press. I can't remember the dot, whatever, but you can find it really easily by Googling it.
That's right. I will link it in the episode description, but I will leave you be, Melissa. Thank you again for everything, and I'll be in touch real soon.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too. Talk to you soon. Bye.